I'd like to offer a few brief remarks in rebuttal. So I want to argue first that the First Amendment does apply on college campuses. Second, that the proponents of a hate speech restriction have not sufficiently solved for the practical implications of enforcing a hate speech restrictions. And finally, that even if those problems could be solved, a hate speech restriction is not the answer to hate on campus. So first, the First Amendment does apply on campus. When we talk about campus, we're not just talking about the classroom. As an undergraduate, oftentimes students live on campus, they eat on campus, they socialize on campus. Everything they do is centered on campus. And that is not limited to the classroom, and academic freedom is not a sufficient framework to regulate those spaces. Now let's move to the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on the First Amendment matters. Exceptions to the First Amendment where speech is not protected are extremely limited, and the Supreme Court has reaffirmed that time and time again. Another thing the Supreme Court has reaffirmed time and time again, as my colleague and I have noted, is that hate speech is not among those protected ideas. Now moving on to my second point, which is that our proponents have not solved for the practical issues associated with administering a hate speech ban. So first, there is the intractable problem of defining what is and what isn't hate speech. My esteemed colleague offered an example of what a definition could look like. But even that example, which is fairly narrowly defined, includes terms that are inherently subjective, such as derogatory. So any derogatory speech against a group that has an immutable characteristic or a characteristic that's hard to change would be considered hate speech. Would someone's religious belief be considered a characteristic that's hard to change? And if so, would a derogatory remark about a religious belief be considered hate speech? These are all subjective questions that have to be answered. And I argue that they cannot be answered with sufficient clarity. And that moves us to the next problem of practical administration, which is who is making those decisions. It's individuals with conflicted interests. And that is a necessary evil of any type of enforcement. So is line drawing, as noted, right? Legislatures, administrators draw lines all the time. But there is a special problem with drawing lines about what ideas and what speech are appropriate and are not appropriate. That is a very tenuous area that is very difficult to do, and the Supreme Court has been loath to do it, except in very narrow exceptions. And additionally, those problems of definition and of who's going to enforce that ban produce the consequences of chilled speech and of unjust enforcement. History confirms, both here in the United States and abroad, that when there are hate speech restrictions, they are enforced in accordance with the injustices that are currently present in society. That is not going to solve for the problems that inevitably exist. So finally, even if those practical problems could be solved, it's true that hate speech restrictions do not help those targeted by hate. They increase the transmission of hate and functionally increase the intensity of the hatred. I think all of us up here and probably everyone in this room can agree that hate speech is harmful, right? No one's going to stand up here and tell you any different. But the question is whether or not it should be protected on campus, and I strongly argue that yes, it should, and that your vote should be yes today.